welcome again, everybody, to the FDA medical device approval process. The concept to master here this afternoon are two questions. The first, what is the purpose of the regulatory authority? Why do we need the FDA? And secondly, what do we need them to do to obtain approval for a medical device? How do we interact with them? So our learning objectives today are quite a few for an hour and a half, actually. We're going to discuss the FDA regulations and the practical application from a sponsor and an investigator obligation viewpoint as it's expressed in the Code of Federal Regulations, which is the law in the United States. Title 21 is FDA, and Part 812 is the IDE section, the Investigational Device Exemption piece. This is what we have to file in order to conduct clinical trials in human beings. Secondly, we're going to describe the structure, the purpose, and the practical application of the ICH guidelines and their principles of good clinical practice, because these are going to guide us through our studies. They are written for drugs. They were recently updated, and we're going to be looking at those because the FDA says they believe in all of them. They have very recently made the updated ICH guideline a guidance document in the United States. And so it is now official as a guidance document for the FDA, and that was just released this past March. So it's fairly new. It doesn't change very much from the older version that you might have been familiar with. We're going to talk about the technical standards that are defined in ISO. ISO, again, is International Standards Organization. It's international organization that's used only for devices. It's a quality statement. FDA doesn't pay too much attention to it, but there's a lot of good verbiage in there for SOPs, for example, or for some of the monitoring plans that you might be devising. We're going to talk about the common terms that are used in device research. Some of them are familiar to you, some of them might not be, because some companies have adapted pharmaceutical language instead of using the device words. We're also going to discuss the three decisions in device development: classification, equivalence, and risk. This is from a regulatory standpoint, just to get you familiar with the types of studies that we might be conducting in device development. We'll talk about the two regulatory pathways to market, whether we're going to use a PMA, pre-market approval, or a 510K, which is more or less a generic version of a device. We'll talk about navigating the FDA approval process, what the sponsor would do when they're actually applying for that or waiting for an approval at the end for a PMA or a 510K. We'll talk about what is in an IDE and a PMA. What's the contents there? So anyone getting ready to prepare submissions might be interested in that particular piece, and what the review process is within the FDA. So let's start out with the regulatory piece. From a regulatory oversight, we want to see what does the FDA have to do with any of this. And it would be somewhat similar in all countries. The FDA counterpart in other countries are very, very similar when it comes to the protection and the day-to-day work that they would do. We're going to concentrate today on the FDA, however, for the United States. The oversight purpose here, then, is to protect the rights, the safety, and the well-being of the consumer. It's also to promote the public health by reviewing these clinical studies to make sure that we've done everything we could do to make them as safe as possible and that it's okay to start the study. We're not jumping the gun and trying to move too quickly. And also, when we've conducted the studies and we prepare the package for marketing, do we have enough information from our clinical trial to meet the labeling that we're asking for? What are the claims that the sponsor is after? Have they actually conducted the trials appropriately to meet those labels? The last one is protect the public health, and they do that once the project is marketed, once the product is out there, in terms of recalls, watching over the manufacturing facilities to make sure that the devices that are manufactured are the same as the devices that were used in the clinical study. Very often, sponsors move from one manufacturing plant to another. They may use their own pilot facilities to produce the devices that we use in the clinical trial. And then when it gets to a larger scale, move to a different manufacturer that is able to produce the mass numbers that they might be needing. All the devices in the United States are managed by CDRH, which is the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. That's the second largest group within the FDA, the largest group being CDER, Center for Drug Evaluation and Research.